Hello and welcome to Oddball Book Reviews. I'm the Oddball Book Reviewer. uh, and today we'll be talking about Bobiverse. Um, for those of you who have never read it, it's a book about, well, it's a sci fi book about a man who ends up becoming a von Neumann probe. And a Van Neumann probe essentially is a probe that is sent out into the universe and is able to make copies of itself and then continue to go on out into the universe further away and so on and so forth. What happens to Bob is that he goes into a cryonics lab and signs up to have his head frozen after death, and he pretty much immediately gets killed. So, yeah, he gets trained to be a Van Neumann probe and he goes out there in the universe, has a conflict with one of the other probes called Medeiros, but eventually he is able to make more clones of himself, and at least two of those clones decide to go back to Earth, where they find that the clone Medeiros is bombing the planet with asteroids, and 99% of the Earth is dead. I believe it was something like 3 million were left. And so they have to essentially get the rest of humanity off of Earth before everybody dies. But that's not going to be easy because it's going to take uh, 1,500 ships or 1,500 trips. And that's very difficult considering that there's not really that much metal to make that many ships. Anyway, eventually they get some of the people off before they run into the others, which is a species of aliens, and there's a big conflict there. Essentially, which today I'm going to be reviewing the first three books, not just the first book itself, because I think they're all kind of a trilogy, and I rather do all three. Anyway, so the first three books, they are all about this conflict with the others. And as far as the story goes, I truly love the story. It is a bit different from most of what you would see out there, especially the fact that it's the Bobiverse, and there's literally dozens of Bobs. If there was one complaint I had, it would be that there are just too many Bobs, and it's hard to keep them straight, especially if you know you don't catch it at the very beginning. Which I read or listened to the audiobook, and it is easy to miss who is actually speaking, even though it does say it at the beginning of every chapter. Um, or who is the point of view character. And if you don't catch that, you might be sitting there thinking, who is this Bob? And of course, uh, you sometimes come across brand new Bobs, ones you've never even uh, met before. And it gets a bit confusing. But otherwise, yeah, the story is great. It's got that certain bit of weirdness to it. Uh, where you're dealing with clones of him, and it each of those clones is almost doing its own thing. In fact, that might be the other complaint about the story, is the fact that there are so many stories going on. uh, there's tons of little plot threads that you can pull. There's the main story, obviously, with the conflict with the others, but heck, even the main Bob isn't really interested or working on that. He's found a intelligent species in which he's kind of adopted and is trying to help, in this hostile environment that they live in. Well, the other Bobs, the clones of him, are taking care of the others and trying to get humans off of Earth and all this stuff. And even then, there's extra stories. There's a love story between Howard and Ephemeral, is what they call them. And that's actually pretty interesting. Uh, as far as other characters in the story, though, one of the biggest problems is like it's mostly about Bob, and there's maybe I don't know, three humans other than Bob that you actually get to know in any meaningful way. Even an important character like Philip, who is Bridget's husband. Um, and Bridget is one of those humans who you actually get to know, and she's the love interest of Howard and all of this stuff. And uh, her husband Philip, who is also a friend of Bob, we barely know at all. Like I would be surprised if he gets 10 pages. I'm not even sure he gets that much, and it's not even really about him. It's more about the situation between him and Bridget or his death or different things, but you don't get to know him at all. And he's just more of a plot thread. And that's pretty much it for all of the humans except like three of them. And so it's mostly just Bob. And that's fine. They do all the Bob clones do have slight differences, but of course they are all Bob and they are very Bob like, I guess, even though they do have slight differences, which also gets a little confusing. But really, as far as I'm concerned, that's to its benefit, especially since the story isn't your traditional story where you have, a goal at the end and you gotta, start here and do all these things in order to make it to the goal. Instead, we're like in a highway, a 12-lane highway, and we're watching all of the cars do their own thing, at their own speed, and uh, jumping back and forth, watching each one. And it makes for a very interesting story. Um, as far as the writing style, the writing itself is very well done. Like there's no complaints whatsoever about that. It's probably just that fact that there's so many different storylines. It does get a little confusing, and so many different Bobs. It gets a little confusing. But as far as the story, I'd say, or not the story, as far as the writing, I'd say it's just very well done. All the characters are likable. I mean, most of them are Bob, and Bob is likable. The It is meant to be a bit funny, although I don't think it's actually as funny as some people have raved about it. It's not really meant to be a comedy. It has a lot of what you would call uh, reference humor, and I don't mind the references, especially since I do get a lot of them. I did grow up with Star Trek and all this stuff, and that's where a lot of the references come from. But I feel like for some people, some of the references may be very dated, and it may be very hard for them to even understand what the heck is going on or why it's supposed to be funny. But if you don't even consider the funniness, it is actually a fairly serious story. And if you take it seriously, it actually, I feel like it may be a little bit more enjoyable if you're not trying to find humor in everything. I do feel like sometimes he may try a little too hard to be funny, especially with references. Um, and like I say, the writing style is fine. Uh, as far as other complaints that somebody might have, it is very anti-religion, and if you're very religious, you might find an issue with that. And I can understand. I did grow up Catholic, and that's you know, back then I may have taken issue with it, but I don't actually mind, even as a religious person. It everybody's entitled to their opinion and all of this stuff, and Bob is very just anti-religious, so. But I don't think it detracts from the story at all. Anyway, as far as well, let's see, my strangeness scale, the stranger meter, I would give it a solid 7 out of 10. Mostly just because of the multiple plot lines and the fact that it's Bob clones and all this stuff. It just gives it this very strange nature. But in fact, I'm not even sure I'd give it a 7 out of 10, maybe a 6 out of 10, because beyond the clones and the multiple storylines, everything is fairly bog standard for a sci-fi story. The it's an adventure going out into the universe. There's aliens, and there's saving humanity from themselves and all this stuff, which, as I say, is kind of standard for a sci-fi fantasy. Um, but yeah, the clones do give it a very, very unique spin. So it does still rank pretty high on the Strangeometer. As far as the actual, like, my rating of it, I'd almost give it a 9 out of 10. And that's mostly because, as far as sci-fi uh, books, which I've not read terribly a lot of, but I have watched a lot of sci-fi, you know, media. It's probably one of my favorites. It, and I've read the likes of Dune and stuff, and I do love Dune, but I wouldn't put Dune above bobiverse, at least as far as enjoyment factor. Like, I really enjoyed the bobiverse. So yeah, I'd give it a 9 out of 10 and probably call it my favorite sci-fi, though not favorite book by any means. Um, and obviously I recommend. But anyway, I think that's about it for Bobiverse. Check it out if you haven't already. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'm LW Greenwood, and if you'd like to check out my book, I would very much appreciate it. And stay odd, my friends.